Fire and brimstone or love and glitter? Can religion really handle queerness? Hi there, I'm Chris with a K, and welcome back to This Week in Queer History, where we celebrate queer moments and icons that I wish I had known about as a young gay kid growing up in conservative America. This week, we're journeying into the tumultuous realm of religion and queer people. For centuries, surrounded by persecution, there were churches that didn't just tolerate, but embraced queer people, offering sanctuary of faith and community. Prepare to have your world rattled as we uncover the incredible and untold stories of acceptance hiding in plain sight.
This week in queer history, stories told with love and glee.
Our journey begins a long, long time ago, long before anyone even uttered LGBTQ. Believe it or not, many ancient civilizations, with all their gods, myths, and temples, didn't share the modern notion that queer love is taboo. In Mesopotamia, for example, the cult, the goddess of Inanna, also known as Ishtar, included clergy who would today be considered queer or trans. Legend has it that Inanna could even swap a person's gender. Her father god Enki supposedly created a third gender of people neither male nor female to serve the temples. Imagine walking into a temple in Babylon 3,000 years ago and seeing priests in flowing gender-ambiguous attire. They were respected as holy servants, and that's how integrated gender diversity was in their spiritual life. In one Mesopotamian prayer, blessings were offered for both opposite sex and same-sex couples, and a loving male-male relationship was said to bring good fortune from the gods. It just blows my mind that in the cradle of civilization, same-sex love could be seen as holy. This is so different from the condemnation that we often hear about right now in our modern times. Now let's jump over to ancient Egypt. 5,000 years ago. No one even batted an eye at bisexuality among men. I have a whole video about Neon Khnum and Khnum Hotep, who were possibly the first documented gay lovers in history. The link is popping up above if you want to watch that video. And in Greece and Rome, well, you might have heard how commonplace male-male relationships were. Just ask Plato or the sacred band of Thebes. I have another video on that, and you can check that out with the link above. But here's the twist. In those pagan societies, these relationships weren't just secular. They were deeply mixed into religious life too. Some Greek myths even hinted at male love, like Zeus and Ganymede. In Rome, Emperor Hadrian's passion for Antinous, it became a cult of its own. And the main thing here is that in many ancient belief systems, being queer wasn't automatically seen as sinful. No, it was more viewed as like heroic or sacred. And the idea that religion and homosexuality have to clash, that came much later with Christian interpretations. But at the time of the Romans and the Greeks, it wasn't an eternal truth. Now, let's not paint the ancient world as a total queer paradise. There was still plenty of patriarchal rules and status concerns, but it shows us that our ancestors had a more nuanced view than we might assume. And in some cultures, queer people even held honored spiritual roles. Many indigenous traditions worldwide have long revered two-spirit or third-gender individuals as shamans or healers, and it reminds us that what later eras tried to erase, earlier ones celebrated. This brings us to the early Christian era, a time period people often assume was uniformly hostile to any sexuality outside of just procreation. And yes, Christianity grew into the Roman Empire's dominant religion, and it developed strict teachings about sex. But even here, history hides some really surprising exceptions. Not all early Christians were as obsessed with condemning same-sex love as later generations would be. In fact, some historians argue that the first millennium of the church had pockets of tolerance or at least ambiguity on the topic. One of the most intriguing and controversial ideas comes from scholar John Boswell. In the 1990s, Boswell stirred up debate by suggesting that a ceremony called adelphopoiesis, literally brother making, used in medieval Christian churches, was effectively a same-sex union rite in disguise. He found records of liturgical prayers where two men were blessed and joined together before God, sharing communion and even a kiss of peace as part of the ritual. According to Boswell, these ceremonies were just like heterosexual wedding ceremonies in form, except the church paperwork politely called the pair spiritual brothers. Now, if this doesn't make you raise an eyebrow, I don't know what will. Now, many of the scholars disagree. They say these rites were about platonic brotherhood, not marriage. But regardless of how we interpret these ceremonies, Boswell's research sheds light on a fact. Early Christian practice wasn't the same everywhere, and some communities might have quietly carved out space for same-sex love. Need more proof? Let's talk about Saints Sergius and Bacchus. These two were Roman soldiers in the 4th century and were venerated as martyrs in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions. Art often shows them standing side by side with halos, sometimes with Christ above blessing their union, imagery very much like married saints. Their own saint's biography describes them in deeply affectionate terms, essentially as devoted partners in faith and love. No one for a millennium thought that was scandalous. In fact, a basilica was built in their honor in Constantinople in 527 CE, and they had a joint feast day on the church calendar. For over 1,000 years, Christians honored Sergius and Bacchus without any record of folks clutching their pearls over the pair's closeness. It's only in more recent centuries that church officials, maybe embarrassed, started insisting, oh, they were just good friends. Right. Just gal pals, sure, Jan. So this evidence strongly suggests earlier worshippers weren't threatened by the idea of two men being that close. I also did another video on this about the first possible recorded gay marriage in a church in 1061. The link is up above, so check it out. And then there's the curious case of Aelred of Rievaulx. Saint Aelred was a 12th century English abbot, a monk in charge of a monastery. He wrote a beautiful treatise called On Spiritual Friendship. In it, he basically gushes about the love between male friends, even comparing it to the love between biblical figures, David and Jonathan, a pair that some interpret as having a romance in the scripture. Aelred believed that pure, chaste love between men could uplift the soul and bring one closer to God. Now, he was still celibate, and he was a monk, so he wasn't openly flouting church rules on sex, but his celebration of emotional same-gender love was a little subtle sanctuary in writing for many. And a lot of historians today think Aelred might himself have been gay, based on how vividly he wrote about the topic and accounts of his close friendships. In a time when the official church line was that sodomy was a sin, you had a respectable abbot effectively saying, loving another man deeply is like experiencing a glimpse of the divine. That's pretty radical. It's as if within the very walls that condemned queer love, a quiet voice was whispering that such love could be holy. And it wasn't just men. In medieval convents where nuns lived in all-female communities, there are records of special friendships between nuns. Lifelong, devoted partnerships that sometimes even led to the two being buried in the same grave when they both died. And as long as they didn't break any explicit rules or cause a scandal, these relationships were often accepted. You could almost say that convents and monasteries had a don't ask, don't tell policy, centuries before that phrase even existed. They upheld celibacy, yes, but emotionally, these environments allowed for intense same-sex bonds, which all looked like they may have just been spiritual friendships of brotherhood or sisterhood. I find this era so fascinating because it's full of contradictions. Publicly, the church grew harsher on sodomy from the medieval period onward, but by the high Middle Ages, confessors' handbooks listed heavy penances for it. And for being gay, well, they didn't call it by that word, but engaging in same-sex acts, it was literally a death sentence in many places. And still, at the same time, human nature didn't disappear. Real people, even in monasteries, fell in love or they formed deep attachments, and sometimes their communities, knowingly or unknowingly, made a little room for that humanity. It's a messy picture, but it shows us something important. Even when doctrine said no, compassion and love found cracks to slip through. Fast forward to the 17 and 1800s. This is the time of powdered wigs, petticoats, and for queer people, peril around every turn. Homosexual acts could get you executed or imprisoned in much of Europe. The church, both Protestant and Catholic, was generally anti-gay in its preaching. You'd think that would snuff out any chance of affirming religious spaces. And yet, hidden in back alleys and behind closed doors, some brave souls in the clergy were quietly doing the unthinkable, welcoming queer people when society would not. So imagine this, Georgian England, the year is 1810, in a dimly lit London tavern called the White Swan, which by day is an alehouse, and by night, it's a molly house. And that's 18th century slang for a clandestine gay meeting place. Upstairs, in a room, hazy with candlelight, a small group of men gather for a secret service. At the front stands an ordained minister. He speaks softly, part sermon, part encouragement, to men who likely haven't heard a kind word from a pulpit all their lives. He might even join two of them in what he calls a marriage, pronouncing blessings over the couple as they exchange rings or vows in hushed voices. This isn't a fantastical scene. It's actually drawn from historical accounts of Reverend John Church, who is arguably England's first openly gay, or at least gay-affirming, minister on the record. Reverend Church was a dissenter preacher, meaning he wasn't from the Church of England, but a Congregationalist. And he became entangled in the infamous Vere Street coterie affair. The White Swan on Vere Street was raided by police in 1810 for being a house of Sodom. In the sensational trials that followed, newspaper pamphlets accused John Church of being the chaplain of that molly house. They claimed, scandal of scandals, that he even performed wedding ceremonies for male couples there. These marriages were described as mock weddings, but to the men involved, they were most likely heartfelt and as real as any legal wedding. While Reverend Church denied some accusations, historians have dug up plenty of circumstantial evidence that he had inordinate affections for men, which in Victorian speak is same-sex love. And in fact, he did minister a secret gay congregation in London. Eventually, he was convicted and jailed on an indecency charge, but not before making his mark as perhaps the first person in modern history to hold religious services specifically for a queer community. Think about how renegade that was. At a time when the mainstream church condemned homosexuality and the law could hang you for sodomy, John Church risked everything to offer fellowship and even God's blessing to gay men. John Church's story isn't an isolated one. As the 19th century rolled on, other voices, sometimes quiet, sometimes scholarly, pushed back against the tide of condemnation. One of the most striking came from John Addington Symonds, a British writer and intellectual who dared to argue for the decriminalization of homosexual acts. Now, Symonds wasn't a priest, but his background was rich in the religious and classical traditions of England, and he grounded his case in morality and compassion. He believed that love between men was not a crime, but a natural expression of humanity, and he used his pen to challenge the cruelty of the law. And just remember, publishing those views in Victorian Britain was no small risk. It was career suicide or worse. Symonds faced intense backlash when his work circulated privately, but his courage lit a spark. And it shows even within a society and a church so bound by rigid rules, there are hearts ready to imagine something softer, something more free and just. Meanwhile, in the pews, rather than in the pulpit, certain churches themselves became de facto safe zones. In Victorian London, it was noticed that some Anglican and Unitarian churches had a rather high number of single men attending services. So here we can read between the lines, these churches, without announcing anything radical, were known to be non-hostile environments. A gay man could slip in on a Sunday, sit through the sermon, and maybe exchange glances or a friendly word with others, and not fear that he'd be shunned or outed. In an age when being openly homosexual wasn't even a concept. Sodomy was just a crime, not really an identity that you would claim. Simply finding a church where you weren't harshly judged was a nice soft resting place. These settled havens, a sympathetic preacher, a tolerant congregation, they helped countless individuals feel a little less alone. Looking back, I like to imagine these compassionate priests and congregations as tiny candles glowing in a vast, dark cathedral. They weren't many, and their light was fragile, but they kept hope alive. They even proved that in times when religion was yielded as a weapon against queer people, there were those on the inside that were extending a hand of fellowship. And it's a part of history that isn't told enough. While the loud voices condemned, quieter ones were saying, "You are loved and you belong." So what about those welcoming seeds that these priests and churches planted? Well, they would eventually bear fruit in the century to come. The 20th century would bring a revolution in the relationship between queer people and the church. One that took those tiny candles and built them into a bonfire of change. By the mid-20th century, the world was changing. Queer people were starting to organize more openly. And we're talking about the homophile movements, the pre-Stonewall pickets, underground queer publications, and all of the horrendous trials of Oscar Wilde were fading behind. But in churches across the world, homosexuality was still a 4-letter word, or maybe just one word, sin. And still, even in this environment, the 1950s and 60s saw some faithful trailblazers daring to say, maybe we got this wrong. One of these pioneers was Reverend Robert W. Wood, a Presbyterian, later Congregationalist, minister in the United States, and a gay man himself. In 1960, Reverend Wood did something completely unprecedented. He wrote a book titled Christ and the Homosexual. Imagine the guts that it took to publish that book in 1960. And in this book, he argued point blank that Christianity should accept homosexual relationships and that the church's rejection of queer people was not based on sound understanding of scripture or science. He famously wrote that the church's attitude towards homosexuality is based on ignorance. This statement would still be fighting words even decades later. Not only did Wood write these radical ideas, he put his money where his mouth was. In 1962, he placed an ad for his book in a national Christian magazine. Try to imagine that. Flipping through a religious magazine in the early 1960s and seeing an ad advocating for gay acceptance. It's almost surreal. This was around the same time that the first ever gay rights pickets were happening, right in front of the government buildings, so Reverend Wood was truly ahead of the curve. He didn't spark a mass movement within the church. The time wasn't quite ripe yet for that, and he still faced a lot of backlash, but he planted seeds, and he proved that not all clergy agreed with the party line, and he provided affirming theological arguments that later queer-friendly ministries would build on. When I think of him, I wish that I could travel back and give him a huge hug and maybe a bulletproof vest of emotional support for being so brave so early on. Now, on the West Coast, something equally groundbreaking was brewing. In 1964, in San Francisco, yes, that beacon of all things progressive, a coalition of liberal ministers and queer activists formed the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, CRH. It was the first organization in the US to explicitly join the words religion and homosexual together in its name, and this signaled something new, a dialogue. The CRH's goal was to promote understanding between clergy and the homosexual community, and to push for social changes, like, say not arresting gay people just for congregating. It included Methodist, Episcopal, Lutheran, and other Protestant ministers, as well as activists like the Lesbian pioneers, Del Martin and Phyllis Leong. These were church leaders basically saying, we need to talk with gay people, not just preach at them. The defining moment for the CRH came on New Year's Day 1965. They organized a big fundraising party, a Mardi Gras costume ball, to support gay and lesbian organizations. And this was a semi-formal event. There were tickets sold, there was a venue rented at the California Hall, and many attendees dressed in fabulous drag or amazing costumes. But most importantly, supportive clergymen and their wives were there in evening wear, literally standing at the door to greet guests and to show police that this event had the church's blessing. Well, guess what? The police showed up en masse anyway. They didn't like this cheeky display of queer joy one bit. They parked wagons outside to intimidate people. They photographed everyone entering. And at that time, imagine the fear of being outed in the papers. And eventually, despite the clergy's presence, they raided the event. And they arrested several individuals, including lawyers who were there to observe the police. There was chaos, drama. It was a scene. But here's the beautiful part, the aftermath. The drag ball incident became known as San Francisco's Stonewall because it galvanized community and notably the religious allies. The arrested people had top-notch legal defense, and at their trial a few weeks later, a group of ministers actually held a press conference blasting the police for their actions. In court, a judge dismissed the charges, and the public narrative started shifting. The good guys in this case included pastors siding with the gays against harassment. And this was groundbreaking. One photo from the time shows a line of ministers from CRH, later dubbed the Gay Priests, looking stern and defiant at the police meddling. And Reverend Cecil Williams of Glide Memorial, a prominent San Francisco church, was among them. And he went further. He opened his church's basement to host gay and trans group meetings throughout the late 1960s. Just think of the trust that built. A church saying to a marginalized community, here's the key to the building, do what you need to do, you are welcome here. These actions by CRH members, they didn't just instantly reform all churches, but they modeled what allyship could look like. The ripples were felt nationwide, inspiring other clergy to quietly consider, maybe we should be reaching out too. So by the late 1960s, you had a few of these pops of religious acceptance, like Reverend Wood, or activist coalitions like CRH, and there was a growing sense that even in some churches, the old approaches weren't working. These were the cracks in the dam, and then in 1968, a floodgate opened in the form of a one-of-a-kind church that would change the game forever. So let's set the scene. It's Los Angeles, 1968. The sun is baking, the Vietnam War is raging, hippies are doing their thing, and a gay ex-Pentecostal preacher named Troy Perry is about to make history in his living room. Troy Perry's personal journey up to that point had been really rough. He realized he was gay while serving as a young pastor, which got him kicked out of his denomination, and he went through a very dark period, even attempting suicide at one point. And he saw firsthand how poorly gay people were being treated, including a friend being arrested just for being gay. But like a phoenix, Perry rose from those ashes with a sense and a mission. He felt called to minister again, but this time specifically to gay people. It was a bold, and some might even say crazy idea. Start a church by and for LGBTQ people at a time when homosexuality was still illegal in most states and classified as a mental illness by the APA. But that's exactly what he did. On October 6, 1968, Troy Perry held the very first service of what he called the Metropolitan Community Church, or MCC, right there in his tiny little pink house in Huntington Park, which is a suburb of LA. He placed an ad in The Advocate, which was just a fledgling little gay newsletter, and he announced a homosexual church service, inviting all gay people who loved God to attend. I mean, can you imagine coming across that in 1968? If I were a young closeted kid then, I would have been very interested in finding out what this was all about. Is it even allowed? I mean, is there a church for us, for me? Well, 12 people showed up to that very first Sunday. Perry preached a very simple message. God loves you exactly as you are. No hiding, no shame. And one attendee later recalled how they wept upon hearing his sermon, affirming that God loves them as they are. These were people who had been told all their lives that they were abominations or that they had no place in God's plan. And suddenly here was a minister saying, this is not true. You are beloved. It was like water to someone who was so thirsty. And for many, it was the first time that they'd ever worshiped without having to wear a mask about who they were. From that humble beginning, MCC grew and grew. The living room quickly overflowed, and after a few weeks, they had to borrow a larger space. And within a year, MCC Los Angeles had a couple hundred members. By 1970, they were holding the first general conference of the Metropolitan community churches, with delegates from new MCC groups springing up in other cities. San Francisco, Chicago, New York. It was like a brush fire of hope had hit the country. And here's an amazing little tidbit. In December of 1968, just 2 months after they had that first service, Troy Perry performed what's considered to be the first public same-sex holy union, basically a wedding in the United States. 2 men asked him to bless their partnership, and he did so in full religious ceremony. We're talking rings, vows, the works. And he even invited the press. You have to remember that this is 1968. Stonewall hasn't even happened yet. Gay sex is still a crime in California, and yet there's Reverend Perry pronouncing 2 men's spouses in the eyes of God. That was trailblazing. The Los Angeles Times wrote it up, probably with a bit of bemused shock. But for gay couples, this was revolutionary. Someone in the clergy treating their love as equally sacred as a straight couple's. And in 1970, he even filed a lawsuit seeking legal recognition of a same-sex marriage, which he lost, unsurprisingly. But it launched the debate on marriage and equality decades before most people would grapple with it. The MCC's early services were a unique blend. Perry came from a Pentecostal background, which meant he liked energetic worship. Lots of singing, amens, maybe clapping, gospel vibes. But it was in a context where gay men and lesbians could openly be themselves. I mean, can you just imagine it? A church with the fervor of a revival meeting combined with the freedom of a gay bar, in the sense that everybody's identity was affirmed. Men came with their partners and didn't have to pretend they were there with their roommates. Women could hold hands with their girlfriend during a prayer. And as Reverend Perry later said, he envisioned a church for people just like me, essentially a spiritual refuge for those cast out by other churches. MCC's founding motto was, "Come as you are," echoing the gospel invitation, "Whosoever will may come." And they meant it. You could come as a drag queen, a leather biker, a trans woman, a questioning teen, but just come. You are welcome. It really is hard to overstate how radical this was at that time. In 1968, the idea of an openly gay church was way beyond the norm. Plenty of churches would have denied that you could be both homosexual and Christian at all at that time. There were police raids on gay bars happening on the regular. Stonewall was just around the corner, and mainstream society mostly kept queer people invisible. So MCC's very existence was an act of defiance and courage. And they did face opposition. They got hate mail. They had death threats. The church in LA was targeted almost immediately by extremists. Windows were smashed, phone lines cut. Some people thought it was a sick joke. Others were outraged at the blasphemy, but the church kept growing. Then in June 1973, tragedy struck that shook MCC to its core. An arsonist set fire to a gay bar in New Orleans called the Upstairs Lounge. And this happened to be where the local MCC group held its services. The fire was devastating. 32 people were killed, including the pastor of the MCC New Orleans, Reverend Bill Larson, and many of his congregants died along with him. It remains one of the most deadly attacks on queer people in U.S. history. There's a really haunting image from that fire, the remains of Reverend Larson's body half out of a burned window because he died trying to escape. Most churches and political leaders at the time responded with cold silence or insincere sympathy. The stigma was still so bad that even in death, these gay victims were ignored or condemned. But not Troy Perry. He flew out to New Orleans and organized memorial services for the victims when virtually no one else would. MCC as a whole mourned and also mobilized. Rather than scare them into hiding, the atrocities galvanized the community. Perry thundered that these were our martyrs, and he pushed harder for recognition of their humanity. It was a defining moment. Hatred tried to snuff out the light, and MCC answered with even more resolve. By 1972, MCC had established dozens of churches across the US, and even a few abroad. They formalized into a denomination, the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches, with their own clergy training, statement of faith, and governance. Through the 1970s, MCC continued to expand, and today there are over 200 MCC congregations in 37 countries worldwide. I mean, isn't that incredible? What started with just 12 people in a living room is now an international network of affirming churches. MCC was, from the very beginning, LGBTQ affirming, and they were doing things that no other churches dared to do at the time. They were blessing same-sex unions, they were ordaining queer clergy, and even engaging in political activism for gay rights. As early as 1970, Troy Perry led protests in Los Angeles against discriminatory laws, and he organized an annual gay pride worship service. Also, MCC people were key participants in the very first pride marches. There's footage of Troy Perry in 1970 with a sign for MCC. And then in the 1980s, AIDS hit. MCC was there though. They provided AIDS ministries, they held the hands of the sick when others wouldn't, and they performed countless funerals. They were often the only church willing to do so for gay men who died of AIDS. This was truly holy work, and it was done in the face of stigma and fear. It saved lives and souls in a very real way. To many, MCC proved by example that you could be both queer and Christian, and that they're not in conflict, but in harmony. They developed queer inclusive liturgies and theology, and they essentially pioneered what we now call queer theology, reading the Bible and Christian traditions in the way that affirms LGBTQ experiences. If you attended an MCC service today, you might hear prayers addressing God as both mother and father, or see a pride flag on the altar, or witness a coming out testimony as a kind of sacrament. They really reimagined what church is, and their influence spread beyond their walls. Other denominations saw that MCC was attracting people and providing meaningful spiritual community, and it made them start to ask, are we missing something? Why are we pushing these people away? It is worth noting that MCC didn't have it easy in the broader religious landscape. They sought recognition. For instance, they eventually got observer status at the World Council of Churches in the 1990s, but in 1982, the U.S. National Council of Churches, which includes most mainland Protestant denominations, they denied MCC membership, which basically snubbed them. Some felt that MCC was too controversial, not a real church, they didn't think that they were following all the Christian rules. But MCC carried on regardless, partnering with local churches here and there and slowly earning respect. Here's an interesting fact. Today, many MCC congregations collaborate with other churches on local projects, and MCC clergy have been involved in numerous interfaith efforts. So even if institutions dragged their feet, on the ground, MCC was making friends and changing hearts. While MCC was blazing trails, the rest of Christianity didn't instantly fall in line. No, not by a long shot. But the 1970s onward did see a slow, determined push within many mainline denominations to become more inclusive. It often started with a small internal group and isolated policy changes, gradually growing into fully accepted movements. Just think of it as like a large ship of institutional religion turning itself around. A slow, creaky pivot, but one that did start happening. One of the first major breakthroughs came in the United Church of Christ, UCC. The UCC is a Protestant denomination known for being relatively liberal. They're the people who trace back to the Pilgrims and Congregationalists, but with a more modern, progressive bent. So in June 1972, they made history by ordaining Reverend William R. Johnson, who was the first openly gay person ordained as a minister in any historic Christian denomination. This was really astonishing for its time. I mean, you have to remember, this is 1972, which is just 3 years after Stonewall. And so here you have an established church saying that an openly gay man can wear the clergy stole and lead a congregation. Reverend Johnson's ordination was a huge deal, and it didn't just happen out of the blue. The UCC had been discussing human sexuality for a while, and eventually they passed a resolution in 1973 supporting civil rights for homosexual persons. Over the years, the UCC continued to lead on these issues. By 1985, they declared themselves an open and affirming denomination, meaning that at the national level, they encouraged all churches to welcome queer people fully. And in 2005, the UCC became one of the first denominations to officially endorse religious same-sex marriage ceremonies. Yeah. They said, we'll perform gay weddings in the church, blessed by God. If you attended a UCC today, many of them have rainbow flags and LGBTQ affirming statements prominently displayed. It's almost hard to remember how edgy that was a few decades ago. In a similar spirit, though not Christian, the Unitarian Universalists Association, or UUA, was way ahead of most people. The UUA isn't Christian per se, it's a liberal religion that draws from many sources, but it does have a lot of ex-Christian members and shares some of that heritage. They formally supported LGBTQ equality as early as 1970. One UUA minister noted proudly that the UUA had been on board with full queer inclusion basically since 1970. And Unitarian churches put their money where their mouth was. The Arlington Street Church in Boston, for example, literally rang its church bells to celebrate the city's first Pride Parade in 1971. They also performed same-sex union ceremonies starting in the 1980s, long before any government allowed gay marriage. And in fact, the first legal same-sex marriage in a U.S. church happened at that very Unitarian church in Boston in 2004, on the heels of Massachusetts legalizing gay marriage. So Unitarian congregations were like this friendly cousin religion, showing Protestants and Catholics how it could be done. Now, perhaps one of the most significant moves in a major Christian denomination came in 1976. That year, the Episcopal Church USA, which is the American branch of the Anglican Communion or the Church of England, they passed a landmark resolution stating that homosexual persons are children of God who have a full and equal claim to love, care, and pastoral concern of the church. This sentence might sound mild today, but in 1976, it was huge. It basically said gay people belong in the Episcopal Church as much as anyone else. And to be clear, in 1976, they did not go as far as to allow openly gay clergy or bless same-sex unions. That would be a ways off. But by officially affirming the dignity of queer people, they cracked the door open that had been firmly shut. It meant an Episcopal priest could no longer justify kicking someone out just for being gay, because the church had said they are children of God with a full and equal claim here. In practice, this resolution emboldened some Episcopal parishes, especially in big cities like San Francisco and New York City. It emboldened them to become quiet havens. For example, Trinity Church in San Francisco, by the late 1970s, was actively welcoming gay parishioners. And by 1985, during the AIDS crisis, Trinity San Francisco was ministering to AIDS patients and hosting support groups at a time when many other churches literally wouldn't even list AIDS victims in the prayers. There's some really heartbreaking stories of families not holding funerals or churches refusing them for AIDS deaths. Trinity San Francisco was the opposite. They became a sanctuary for the sick and the dying. And I have to note that by the 2010s, roughly half of Trinity's congregation was queer. Just think about that. I mean, talk about a transformation. They even ended up hosting a separate LGBTQ-focused ministry in their building. So what started as a policy statement in 1976 blossomed over decades into real, lived inclusivity in many Episcopal communities. The Presbyterian Church had its journey too. In the late 1970s, some local Presbyterian congregations started identifying as more light churches, meaning they openly welcomed LGBTQ people, and they wanted to work for change in the denomination. The term more light comes from a statement: God has yet more light to shine forth, suggesting that God might be revealing new truths about inclusion. One of the first churches to do this was the Lafayette Avenue Presbyterian in Brooklyn, which by the 1970s was accepting openly gay members into its pews and its leadership. The National Presbyterian Church, however, they took a little more time to catch up. They officially prohibited gay clergy and same-sex marriages until 2010s. And it wasn't even until 2011 that the Presbyterian Church removed barriers to ordaining queer pastors. And then 2015, they redefined marriage to include same-sex couples. And that's a long haul from the 70s to the 2010s. But the presence of these more light congregations kept the pressure on through all of those years. They held conferences, they raised their voices at Presbyterian General Assemblies, and they provided immediate refuge for queer Presbyterians who needed a home church in the meantime. The Methodists, the United Methodist Church, and others saw internal activist groups form. In 1984, Methodist allies launched the Reconciling Congregation program, which encouraged individual Methodist churches to declare themselves openly affirming. The term later became Reconciling Ministries Network. By 1985, a handful of Methodist churches, like Calvary UMC in Philadelphia, publicly declared they were reconciling, meaning that LGBTQ people were welcome. Calvary was only the 6th UMC in the nation to do so at the time. The official UMC stance remained conservative, and to this day, it's still a point of major contention. But these reconciling churches basically said, we're not waiting for the hierarchy, we're doing the right thing right now, and they just acted with stunning solidarity. Then in 2013, about 30 Methodist pastors in Philadelphia collectively officiated a same-sex wedding together. So why did they do it in a group? Well, they were standing with the colleague who had been disciplined for doing a gay wedding. By all of them performing one wedding jointly in the Arch Street UMC, which was a historic church, they knew the church authorities couldn't punish all of them. They risked their careers, their pensions, and they were essentially saying, if you expel one of us, you have to expel all of us. This kind of courage, this ecclesiastic disobedience, it echoed the bravery of these ministers, but it was now even more open and covered by the media, causing big conversations among believers. It gave faces and names to the cause, which is powerful in shifting opinions. And I could go on and on and on about these denominations and all of their journeys, because there's just so much growth within these churches. Like the United Church of Canada, which is kind of like Canada's UCC, they voted in 1988 to allow gay ministers, and this caused a national stir-up. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, they agonized for years, but then in 2009, they finally allowed partnered gay clergy and later allowed churches to perform same-sex marriages if they chose to. The Anglican Communion, which is the worldwide Anglican churches, they got a big shake-up and a jolt in 2003 when the Episcopal Church in the United States consecrated Gene Robinson, who was an openly gay man, as the new Bishop of New Hampshire. Bishop Robinson's consecration was historic. He even wore a bulletproof vest under his vestments at the ceremony because of all of the death threats. And it caused so much turmoil in the global Anglican world. Some conservative Anglican provinces even cut ties, and they demanded that the Episcopalians repent. It was really messy, but Robinson's smiling face and his purple bishop's shirt became an icon of what was possible. By 2015, the Episcopal Church went further and officially approved church weddings for same-sex couples across all its dioceses. The dominoes continued. The Presbyterian Church in the US by 2015, the Methodist Church of Great Britain around then, and others all moved to allow same-sex marriage or ordain queer ministers in one form or another. But with it, they faced internal splits. The worldwide United Methodist Church is literally splitting as we speak. In 2022, they began a formal split because a large faction wants to remain non-affirming, while American and European Methodists, they want to inch toward inclusion. Change is hard, but it is happening. And outside of Christianity, there were parallel shifts. Judaism had its transformations too. Reform Judaism, the most liberal branch, began ordaining openly gay rabbis in 1990 and formally sanctioned same-sex unions by 1996. The more traditional conservative Jewish movement took until 2006 to allow gay rabbis in weddings, but they did get there. Now only Orthodox Judaism remains officially opposed, with some exceptions in small modern Orthodox circles. In the realm of Islam, change has been a little slower, but it's underway in small pockets. Groups like Muslims for Progressive Values and the Mecca Institute are advocating reinterpretations of scripture to be more LGBTQ inclusive. In recent years, a handful of LGBTQ-friendly mosques have appeared, like the Unity Mosque in Toronto and an inclusive mosque in Paris. They often operate semi-underground and face huge pushback, but they do exist, providing a safe space for queer Muslims to pray and be in community. There are brave queer imams and scholars now doing the work that Troy Perry did in a different context, saying, "You can be queer and Muslim. Allah's love is for all." And this is truly groundbreaking in the Islamic context, and likely it will be a long journey, but the seeds are planted. And then we have the Catholic Church, the big one. The Roman Catholic Church hasn't changed its official doctrine. It still teaches that homosexual acts are sinful and that gay people are called to celibacy, a teaching that has really caused a lot of pain. But even there, the ground isn't as hard as it used to be. In 1969, a group called Dignity formed as a Catholic gay caucus in the US, which basically is a support network for gay Catholics to meet for liturgies and fellowship, often in borrowed church halls and sometimes with friendly priests celebrating Mass, sometimes in street clothes so as to not draw attention. The institutional church clamped down on Dignity in the 1980s, but Dignity kept going outside parish walls. In 1977, another group, New Ways Ministry, was founded by a nun and a priest to advocate for LGBTQ Catholics. They too got in trouble with the Vatican for a while, but persisted. In 1997, U.S. Catholic bishops put out a pastoral letter called Always Our Children, which, while not endorsing anything like marriage, did urge Catholic parents to love their gay children and reject the idea of kicking them out. They were basically saying, have compassion and don't bully your queer kid. And this was progress, even though it was small and dressed in traditional teachings. And then came Pope Francis. Ah, yes, Pope Francis. He was a mixed bag for sure, but he definitely shifted the tone. In 2013, barely just a few months into his papacy, he famously responded to a question about gay priests with, "Who am I to judge?" And that sent shockwaves. The Pope openly saying something that sounded like acceptance for gay individuals. Even though he wasn't changing doctrine, this was something. Francis went on to meet with gay Catholics, including a transgender man at the Vatican. This was an unheard gesture before. And in 2020, he voiced support for civil union laws to protect same-sex couples' legal rights. This was not church marriages, but it was something. And these steps, while not doctrinal changes, gave many Catholics permission to be more open. Surveys show that in many countries, the majority of lay Catholics now support same-sex marriage and certainly support non-discrimination. In many Western cities, you'll find Catholic parishes that are, for the most part, welcoming, even if it is unofficial. They won't turn away a gay couple who comes to Mass, or they might have an LGBTQ fellowship group. It's still patchwork, and most of the time it's hush-hush, because officially their bishop might not approve, but it is real. So compared to the 1950s, when queer people would be shunned and denied communion, this is a big change. Pope Francis's "Who am I to judge?" is practically printed on t-shirts now. It's not fully acceptance, but it's definitely different from the past. And one thing I want to highlight is the role of activism and safe spaces within the churches. Many churches' physical space became sanctuaries in more than one sense. A historian, Ken Loosbader, he points out that before and after Stonewall, numerous religious leaders and congregations, they let their buildings be used as safe meeting places for LGBT groups. Like in the 1970s, it was common for fledgling community groups, gay community centers, or helplines, or social groups to hold gatherings in the basement of sympathetic churches and synagogues. These were places that cops were less likely to raid, and it gave them a little bit more of an institutional protection. Like we've seen with the Metropolitan Community Church, they obviously did this, but even some progressive synagogues and Quaker meeting houses opened their doors. In the 1980s, when the AIDS crisis hit, some churches in New York and San Francisco literally turned their parish halls into hospices or food pantry sites for people with AIDS. They were way ahead of the government. So houses of worship weren't just talking, they were doing. They gave our communities safe spaces when few others would. That's a legacy we shouldn't forget. And let's not forget the Society of Friends, or the Quakers. And I just mentioned them earlier, but the Quakers have a saying of seeking the inner light in every person, which naturally lends itself to equality. As early as 1963, British Quakers published a groundbreaking report that basically said the quality and depth of love between people is what matters in sexual ethics, not the genders involved. This was way before any church was saying anything close to this, and that report towards a Quaker view of sex laid the theological groundwork for Quakers to later affirm same-sex relationships. By the 1980s, many Quaker meetings or congregations were welcoming LGBTQ leaders and even conducting same-sex commitment ceremonies under the care of the meeting. Quakers in the UK formally approved same-sex marriage in their meetings in 2009, even before UK law changed. In the US, many Quaker meetings are on the record as affirming. So the Quakers, they are true to their values and have quietly led the way with compassion and common sense. All of this progress, from MCC's rise to mainline Christianity policy changes, they all represent a massive shift in the religious landscape from the mid-20th century to today. They say that history arcs towards justice, and I do believe that we've lived through an arc bending in that direction in spiritual spaces. Now, is everything perfect? No. There are still many conservative churches and regions where being gay or trans is seen as incompatible with faith. The progress we've made can even provoke backlash. We've seen some of that today, unfortunately, but the momentum is real. When I see a lesbian bishop preaching in a cathedral, or a pride flag flying outside of a Baptist church, or even a trans man leading prayer at a mosque's inclusive prayer group, I see the progress in faith. These hidden sanctuaries have become more open. Now, if you were born in Utah, you were born into religion. Yes, Mormonism. I didn't know many people outside of the church until high school. But then, in high school, there was Mary, and she was Catholic. Oh my, heaven forbid. Yeah, but it was really funny because everyone talked about it too. Like, she'd moved in from Mars. She was beautiful and popular, so that got her a pass, but that's what it was like. So weird. Living in a place where everyone seemed to believe the same thing, but then there was me, and I always felt just a little bit different. And I sensed it early, I didn't fit perfectly into this Mormon world. Like many religions, it comes with a lot of rules, stacked on top of more rules. You break one, you question one, or you dare to step outside the lines, and all of a sudden, you're not part of the flock. And what you're supposed to do? You're supposed to put your shoulder to the wheel, push, conform, be reverent. But I always knew that I wanted something more. I wanted more possibility, and, that was not the good Mormon way. When I began to drift away, it wasn't just leaving a church, it was leaving an entire community. And that's the hard part about being raised in a faith. Your friends, your family, your whole world is tangled up in it. And around the same time, I was starting to understand my own sexuality, and deep down, I knew there was no belonging to a church that would never let me be me. But then during college, after I had started to become more confident in who I was, and thanks to Claudia, my incredible history teacher, I wandered into an Episcopalian service, and suddenly religion looked a little different. This church was blessing gay people, and they were embracing people like me. For the first time, I thought maybe faith didn't have to mean hiding. Maybe it could mean belonging in the open, because I still wanted that sense of community, that built-in place to gather to sing, to share life's mysteries. And for a while, I tried to make it work within that Christian framework, but eventually I found a new spiritual path that wasn't tied to any one religion, but still it lacked that weekly gathering of community. And there's the struggle. As queer people, we don't have that same guaranteed gathering place week after week, like the way that churchgoers do, to talk, to simply exist in one another's presence. And I do think we need that, not because of God necessarily, or prophets, or doctrine, but because of community. That's the piece that matters most. And that's what I think so many of us are hungry for. I still hope we can build it, and not with the rigid, rule-bound way that I grew up with, but in a way that celebrates difference. And maybe it's Sunday brunch, a book club, maybe it's a queer hangout. The Gay Men's Chorus was really close for me, that weekly ritual of going and singing with other gay men. I definitely have visited bars and circuit parties and seen how that could be a taste of it, but they're still lacking for me. I can't connect the way that I want to in bars and the circuit space. So I think maybe that special community space is something that I haven't found yet. And whatever form it takes, I think the most important part is community and the weekly ritual. It's that guaranteed place you can return to, whether you're the one in need or the one able to help. And that to me is the heart of faith. Not obedience, but connection. Not conformity, but community. And I believe that's something that we as queer people can create for ourselves in our own image, with joy, with love, and with room for everyone. Thank you so much for watching and traveling through all of these stories of queer faith with me. And now I would love to hear your thoughts. Where have you found religion and spirituality? And where is your sanctuary? Drop a comment below. I love to read them all, and I respond to them all. You can also get more queer history by clicking this video popping up right over here. And if you're looking for a fun way to celebrate LGBTQ history and your little self, head on over to myqueerbirthday.com. Link is down in the description below. Until next time, stay strong, stay bold, and keep making history.